Hi everyone, my name is Lincoln Baxter, and today I'm going to be telling you how to make all of your wildest dreams come true with HTML5, Errai, and Errai UI. So this is the only slide in my presentation. I'm going to be doing entirely demos for you guys. Hopefully you will like what you see. So let me go ahead and switch over here. I'm going to just show you basically a GWT application. I have a bare bones app set up right now. And this thing is just going to print a message to the window, just like a JavaScript window.alert. I can't make it any bigger for that screen, sorry. So this application is basically just very simple. It's one class, and it's just going to print an alert statement to the screen. Here it is, hello from Errai. And this is pretty much basic GWT functionality. But let's look at the scenario where we're working on a project, and our designer has given us this application mock-up, and we need to make this actually work. We need to make it do something. So they've given us this file. And this is a game. It's called It All Started When. And it's a storytelling game. So what happens here is you start typing, and the story appears on the left, and people can just sort of add and continue building on this story as you go along. And here we see little Jenny went to the store to buy a laptop, but they sued her and she was sad. So we're going to go from taking this, let's make it actually do something. So our application here is just, like I said, an entry point. This is an Errai annotation that says this is the beginning of the class. When you load the page, load this class and do whatever we have in the post-construct method or the init method. So the first thing we're going to do here is apply our template. So we need to extend the composite GWT base class. And we then add the Errai UI templated annotation, and we point at our mockup file, which is over here in our sources. So mockup.html. And the way Errai UI works is when you provide your HTML file, you need to tell it, okay, which part of this file do you want me to display? Do you want me to pull up and show in the browser? In this case, Errai UI will default to like the outermost element, but because this is a complete mockup, we only want to take a piece of this to use as our template for the application. So we have our container here. We're going to take that and show that in the browser instead of our pop-up here. So we do that using the data field annotation. And we're just going to call this root. And then back over here in the application, we say mockup.html and then root. And that's all we have to do. We can get rid of this. And then because this is a component, a GWT component, we need to tell GWT to actually display this now. So we're going to say root panel .get .add this. So we're just going to make this show up. So I refresh this page, and something went wrong. I think that I have syntax error here. I extended the wrong class. It's composite, not component. Now we should see our template applied. There it is. So we just went from no app to applying this template. And there's a little bit of stuff that I've done here beforehand. Every GWT application actually needs a host file. In this case, we have a JSP that's just going to be displaying our style sheets and our JavaScripts for this template. I've already done that for you. Here's all the bootstrap JavaScripts, and the styles are up here. It's just like we have in the mockup file here. So now we've got this showing up. Let's make it do something. So we want to be able to type our name here, and then type our message and have that message show up on the left-hand side. The first thing we need to do is take over parts of this page now. We have this HTML showing up. We can actually just sort of like reach out into it and say, this is going to take on this new functionality. And we're going to do that using injection, and the Errai UI data field. The data field annotation says, just like our templated annotation, the piece of the template that we are referring to is going to take on the behavior specified in our Java class. The Java class is defining behavior for that HTML element. So we're going to inject in this case, a text box, and we're going to call that name. And then we'll also inject a text area, and we'll call that story. Then we also have a button over here, and we're going to take that over using a JDBT button. So now that we have these data fields injected in our Java class, we need to tell Errai UI what this actually means in the HTML. Just like we identified the root element of the template, we can now go over here and say, this input field is the name, using the data field. This text area is the story. And this button is the submit button. So let's prove that this worked and actually add some behavior so that when we click this button, we can see something happen. So we're going to go here and we're going to say event handler. This is another Errai UI annotation. And this is a public void click submit. And we're going to handle the click event. And when this happens, we're just going to say window.alert clicked. We also need to tell the event handler what it's handling. In this case, it's the submit element. What's your question?
It's a lot like struts.
It's a little bit like struts, a little bit like Wicket. So now we refresh. Type our name, story, and when we click submit, we see that we have now behavior in our submit button. And that was only maybe like 10 lines of code to get this working. So now let's take it a step farther. Let's say we want to now accept our inputs. We want to be able to, when we click the submit button, have this story go and go into the database and then show up on the page. The first thing we need to do here is we need to add an object to hold this data that we're going to be collecting from our form. So I'm going to go over to JBoss Forge here, and Forge is a rapid application development tool. In this case, I'm going to be using it on my existing application just to add a persistence layer and also add one entity so that we can save our story as we go along. So I'm going to do persistence setup, I'm going to use Hibernate, and I'm going to use the JBoss AS 7 container. Go with a few defaults. Now we have a persistence XML set up for us with a default data source. And now I'm going to create our entity, and I'm going to call it a story fragment. We'll put it in the, actually let's not put it there because we need to tell, JDBT needs to be able to see this on both the client and the server side. So we need to create a package called client shared. And that's where this is going to go. So let's go back into that. UI, client shared, fragment. All right. Now we're going to add some fields to this class. We're going to add the field string named the name of the person who's submitting the story. So we add that, and then we'll also add the story itself. The question is, how does this compare to JSF? Is this an alternative? And my answer would be yes. In the cases where you're using JDBT, they're probably the richer web applications, whereas JSF is more data entry oriented. It's a little more difficult to do the kinds of complex visual things that we're going to do here, and we'll probably see what the difference would be in just a few minutes.
What's the name of the rich
So Rich Faces does a lot of similar things here, but this is an alternative development strategy. The programming models are very different. Errai is using Cdi in the browser to bring the Java programming model to the actual client side. So now we have our fragment here. We're ready to start collecting the data from our form, and we're going to package that up and send it to the server. The first thing we need to go do is go back into our app, and we're going to use something called a data binder. A data binder is an Errai tool that lets you bind a model object to the actual forms that you're seeing on the interface, the web interface itself. So if we inject data binder for our fragment object, this is going to be an auto-bound data binder. Now we can say this story is bound to our data binder. This name is bound to our data binder. And now when we do anything with these fields, if we type anything in on the user interface, it automatically gets stored into the model object of this data binder. Which means that when we click the submit button, we can now, if I add a toString method to this guy, it's already there. Forge is taking care of that for us. I can say sysout fragment builder .get model, and we should see our values of the form fields print out into the JWT dev console. So let's go ahead and refresh this. Oh, what have I done wrong? All right. So this is a situation where I've actually forgotten to do a necessary step. In order to bind to an entity, you actually need to add the bindable annotation, which tells Errai UI that it's proxyable and can be bound between the user interface and the model. So there we are. So now if I type my name and our story and click submit, here it is in the dev console. We've now bound those values and we have access to them programmatically. So let's go ahead and send this to the server now. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my app and I'm going to say, well, how are we going to get this to the server? Errai comes with a very rich and very easy way of communicating data between the client and the server, and that's using the Cdi Event System. If you're familiar with that, the Cdi Event System is very simple, publish, subscribe, you fire an event and then you can observe it somewhere else in the application. In this case, we're going to fire an event on the client in the browser. That event is going to go over the Errai bus and be observed on the server in a very simple manner. So let's go ahead and inject a new event. We're going to inject our Cdi event class. This is a part of the Cdi specification. And this is going to be fragment added. And we need a new class to contain our event here. This is also going to go into the shared package. So we need a new class for our event type. Fragment added. And in this case, it's also going to be a portable class, which is telling Errai this class can go between the client and the server. If you didn't do this, if we didn't have this concept of a portable annotation, all of the data that you fired on the server and all of the data that you fired on the client would go out, it'd be going back and forth all the time. So we need to say what actually should go between, because you may want to fire an event on the client that is only observed on the client. And this is what lets us distinguish that. So I'm going to go ahead, create constructor. We're going to take a fragment. And, oops. Once we get this set up, We also need to use the maps to annotation. Actually, yeah. So this is an annotation that tells Errai how to actually marshal this object. Maps to, because I have a non-default constructor, we need to tell Errai, where do I put this data that you're giving me? So we're just going to say maps to fragment. And also get fragment. There's our event class. But let's take this one more step. Let's make a base class because we know we're going to have a few of these events for different types of actions we're going to make in our application. So we're going to create a fragment event. We're just going to move all of this over here. And then add a constructor in our extension class. And there we are. So now we have this event class. Let's actually package up the data from the client, fire this event, and exert it on the server. In our application, we started adding this event. So now we have an event class that when we click our handler, we're actually going to fire a new fragment added event. And we're going to pass in the model object from our data binder. So just directly taking that model that we found, passing it into the event class, and that's going to get fired over to the server. But now that we've fired this event, we also need something on the server side to be able to handle this, to save this into the database. So we're going to go over here and make a new class on the server. And we're going to call this Fragment Listener. We're going to make this a stateless class. Let's go ahead and inject a persistence context. And now we need an observer method. This is as part of the Cdi specification. This is the other side of the firing. You now observe this event. So we have a public void handle added observes fragment added event. Now we're simply going to take this event class, get the fragment out of it. We're going to pass this directly into the entity manager.persist method. And just to prove that we have this working, we're going to set a breakpoint. And I actually need to republish because I've now added a server-side class. If I were using something like JRebel, I could possibly avoid this, but just to keep things simple, I'm going to republish. My IDE is complaining at me here. All right, so we redeployed. Now when we come back to our client, we can refresh the page. What have I done wrong here? Probably need to make this portable. Now that we're back up and running, we can pick up and fire our story. And on the server side, we should now be able to see this come across. Okay, we hit our breakpoint. It's not attaching the source, but we did break on the server. Let's go ahead and continue. And now, once we've added this, we need to get it to show up in the UI. We need to present it now to the people who've typed it in. So we're going to add another event class. This one should work a little bit better. This is a fragment display event. And in our listener now, we're going to inject another event class telling the client to display this now. And we're going to take the same fragment that we just added and send it right back. So now it has an ID and a version, but that doesn't really matter to us because we're not doing anything with that yet, but we will later. So now on the client side, we go back to our application class, excuse me, and we add another method. This is going to be a public void added fragment method. And this observes the fragment display event. And now we need to add this back to our user interface. So we're going to go back to our template. We're going to say, okay, where do we want this to show up? In this case, we have these, the story that's right here in the main section of our application, and we want the story to be displayed there. So we add a new data field. We're going to call this fragments. And then each individual fragment is going to be displayed in one of these spans. And once you take over a piece of the interface, it's actually going to be replaced by whatever you define in the Java class. So you could inject something, you can build your own widget and then just have Errai use that. As long as it's constructed, it'll come into the template and sort of like take over and hijack what's here. But the interesting thing about Errai UI and why this is so nice is because the attributes that you define in the template are preserved. So when any of your styles, your scripts, they're all passed over automatically to the widgets that you define in Java. Whereas if you were using something like the JDBT data binder or building things up programmatically, you would have to set the styles individually in those classes. It's a little more difficult to style the data binder unless you're using the JDBT template. The template system. So this data field is going to be story, and now we need to be able to put this in something. So here we're going to actually define our own widget instead of injecting it. We need to have a list to put these widgets in as they come back. So we're going to define a new data field still, and this is going to be an HTML panel called fragments, and we're just going to construct it ourselves instead of letting Errai do that. And the tag is going to be a div, and it's not going to have anything in it. Actually, I think HTML panel by default is a div, but just for the sake of clarity, we'll do it this way. So now I've bound this. Now I need something to represent the fragment itself. We're going to be adding many of these things, so we probably want our own widget class to represent each fragment as it comes in. So I'm going to make a new class named fragment widget. And again, we're going to extend the composite base class and template this. Now, this is another class, and we can do exactly what we did with that root template and say we need to get this from the mockup.html, and if this were in a different package, we could specify the fully qualified package name and tell it where this template is living. And now we need to pick out the piece of that template, just like we did with the base application, in this case the fragment, which is going to pick up this span and the anchor tag for where we're going to display our text. So in this fragment widget now we can inject a new data field. This is going to be an anchor called story. Yep, story. And once we have this, we're going to go ahead and do this from our app class. We need to now be able to create new fragment widgets as we get data from the server. So in our observes method here, we're going to utilize the Cdi instance class. And the instance class says, I've got this type here, and this type is a fragment widget. And every time I want a new fragment, I'm just going to call fragment instance .get, and I get a new instance of that widget. The reason we do it this way is because Errai UI uses Cdi to construct its objects. So if you don't use injection, you should use the instance class to be able to just fire off and get new instances of these widgets. So once we have an instance of this, we're also going to set the fragment. And we're going to get the fragment out of our event class that came back from the server. So let's create this method in our class here. And when this fragment comes in, we're going to store it so that we can access it later. We're also going to take the text from this story. We're going to say get story if that is not equal to null. Then we're going to perform a little bit of a cleanup on it because people might type things weird and we want it to show up nicely. So we're going to say fragment.setStory equals fragment.getStory .replace all. We're going to get rid of any new lines on the end. And we're also going to replace new lines with the BR tag so that we show up nicely. We're going to take anytime we press enter here, we're going to replace that with just a break so that it shows up nicely in the story. So we're going to replace all new lines with a couple BR tags. Now, I'll put a little caveat on this. I'm going to be setting this as HTML into my display directly. Normally you would want to actually use safe HTML if you do this, but for the purposes of time, I'm just going to put it directly as HTML, which would lead you vulnerable to like cross-site scripting attacks and stuff like that. So just so you know, don't actually do it this way. You want to use the safe HTML API instead. But once we get our story, we're now going to take our anchor and we're going to set the HTML. Here's where you would use the safe HTML API. And we're just going to get it out of the fragment now that we've cleaned it up a little bit. Put it right there. We're also going to set the name so we know who sent this in. Fragment.getName is not equal to null. We're going to again set the title. Actually, let's set the title of this. So let's get this element, set title, fragment.getName. All right, so let's go back here. Now we have an instance of this class, but we haven't actually added it to anything yet. That's why we created our HTML panel to hold all of these things in the template. So we're going to say fragments.add the new instance that we just created. And we also need to return this, just to make things a little more convenient. Okay, so there we go. So now, just to recap, we're going to be collecting the data from the interface, packaging it up with a data binder, firing it as an event to the server, and the server is going to respond with another event that the client observes and is actually going to show up on display. And the reason this collapsed is because I've replaced the HTML element in our template, which is this div, with the div that actually has nothing in it anymore, because we haven't added any fragments yet. So if I wanted to fix that, I could go over to our app, and where I've defined this HTML panel, I could just do something like add one character, and this div is going to show up again. It also actually, I think, makes a nice display so people know that that's where the story is going to show up. But I'm no user or interface designer, so don't take advice from me on that. All right, so now let's see if this actually works. My name's Lincoln, and the story started when little Jenny went to the store. So we are actually adding fragments to the display here. But I think maybe I made a little typo.
Alright, let's get rid of this for now. I think I'm trying to be too fancy. There we go. So I was probably replacing all of my string with nothing, which is why it wasn't showing up. So I went to the store. This is information that's going from the client to the server, back to the client. And the reason we send it to the server and then back to the client is because we want the ID of this. We want to be able to click on these objects and delete them. But since we're running low on time, and I've had some technical difficulties, I'll just show you guys the grand finale right now. This is actually a collaborative application that we've built. Just lose my browser. So when we add something here, let's say we're Joe. Joe is going to tell me that I went to the store and bought some Errai goodies. This is actually going to be collaborative between all clients because we've used the portable events. When we fire that on the server, it gets broadcast by default to all of our clients. So we have a collaborative application for free here. This is what I meant when I said that Errai is basically very good at building these rich interfaces that would be more difficult to do with something like JSF or conventional server-side frameworks, because you have this client server-side relationship that's very easy to use. You have the standard APIs that you're used to using, like the instances from Cdi, observing events, firing events. It's all very simple, very basic, and very easy to consume. You can go from here to the moon. You know, you can do tons of crazy stuff, like real-time stock ticker type push. This is all, like, it's basically real-time. I mean, when you fire this event back to the server, Errai is using long polling by default, so that connection never, it doesn't close, and the server can just keep sending information back to the client. So that's why this is working. So I could just keep clicking this button here, and it shows up everywhere. Now we're running in dev mode, so it's a little bit slower, but this is really, I mean, a very easy way to get a very scalable, distributed client application all over the web. So, do you guys have any questions? Nope? Cool. Well, thank you for joining me. Sorry for the brief technical difficulties, and I hope you, if you want to check it out, go to jboss.org/Errai. You can also check the Errai blog at errai.blogspot.com.